All right, page 37 on the Rainy River. So this story, and there's one or two other chapters that are like this in the book, in which it's going to feel normal, right? It's linear. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's, an opening, there's rising action, there's the climax, there's denouement, falling action. It's going to have all the trappings of what we normally associate with a regular story. In spite of that, or in the face of that, so to speak, O'Brien, the author, is still going to be invoking certain hallmarks of postmodernism. So let's take a look at this story. It is set up for us as a kind of confessional, a kind of bearing of the soul, so to speak, a kind of telling of truth, which again is one of those things that you can do to spin a story, make it feel truthful, to make it feel more real. As if you frame it as a confessional, then maybe you get like a little few more breaks, especially if you're talking to a teacher or a parent or somebody, an authority figure. They may feel a little bit more empathy for you if what you're doing is revealing some sort of deeper truth. So we get that opening. He then has this really interesting little discursus about courage, which is going to become significant when we get to the very end of the story. He frames courage, what it's like to have courage, where courage exists, in what I think are probably pretty typical terms for most people. We tend to think it's like a reservoir we have inside of us that's going to be like, enacted upon, that we can draw on at certain moments in our lives, and we'll be able to do it, and we just kind of, it's like a savings account, right? We stash it away. He, of course, alludes to very overtly that this is not, in fact, the case when on page 38 he says it was a comforting theory, right? It dispensed with all those bothersome little acts of daily courage. It offered hope and grace to the repetitive coward. It justified the past while amortizing the future, right? Implying, of course, that, by calling it a theory and by, starting to unpack or undermine the very idea itself, that's not exactly how courage works. Interestingly enough, a week ago or so, I saw an interview with the author Brené Brown, who has she's a psychologist, and I can't remember now what university, and her work largely has been on leadership. And as a result of that, she's done multitude of psychological studies on trying to understand some things like courage. And her conclusions is that courage is born out of and is actually a function of vulnerability, right? That when we make ourselves the most vulnerable is in fact when we are the most courageous. So you just tuck that somewhere and sort of meditate on that for a while, see what happens. Okay, so we get this setup, right? We get this, he's doing this backstory about, a college kid or a college-bound kid. He's actually college. He's just graduated college. He's going to be on his way to graduate school when he gets the draft notice that his number is up, and he's going to have to go report the basic training. And we get this kind of internal wrestling that happens. And it's described on page 39. I remember opening up the letter, scanning the first few lines, feeling the blood go thick behind my eyes. I remember sound in my head. It wasn't thinking, just a silent howl. A million things all at once. I was too good for this war, too smart, too compassionate, too everything. It couldn't happen. I was above it. The choice of the noun howl there, I think is worth stopping on for a split second and drawing our attention to, in large part because there's a really famous long poem by the beat poet Allen Ginsburg entitled Howl, right? So Allen Ginsburg's Howl, and it's worth looking up if you want an experience of what the late 50s, early 60s were like. Because Ginsburg, I would consider him a great American poet in the tradition of American poetry, is trying to recapture that, or is trying to lay that bare, what it's like and the conflicts and complications. Howl opens, I'll read you just a few lines. He's got a famous opening sentence. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of the night. incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind leaping toward poles of Canada and Patterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time between. Howl is a poem about, well, it's a poem in a certain way about trying to track down truth, trying to track down true meaning or reality, and finding that it doesn't exist in the ways in which we have tried to make it, right? You know, and in the ways in which the best minds of our generation, the generation of the 50s and 60s, the post-World War II generation, you know, have been destroyed by madness, by the madness of our foreign policy, our government, our institutions, our whatever it is, right? Ginsburg, of course, very much on a kind of anti-war, anti-establishment side of things, but writing in the voice of what at that time was the American, what was styled as the American youth. And this howl, you know, the fact that the poem is called Howl, it raises up whatever it's some. If you buy it in the book form, it's some like 60 pages long, right? And the idea that this howl rages up like a howl against a howl of despair, a howl against the established society that had been created coming out of the post-World War II 50s, consumer culture and those kinds of things, and how those things had, while been pleasurable, had also inured us or removed us from the search for truth, the search for meaning. And Ginsburg is, in a sense, lamenting that, but also at the same time recognizing that it's probably not possible anymore. And in a similar sort of like really small way, but I think it's significant. I mean, writers have words to choose from, and they know what they're doing, right? And O'Brien is of that age, of that time period. O'Brien, the author, that he would have come across. He's a reader, Ginsburg, Howl, and so he's thinking, you know, here when the letter arrives, in his head is that silent howl against things. He spends the summer languishing, and doing some really horrific work at a pig factory, cleaning up pig carcasses, right? And just trying to figure out what he's going to do. Is he going to go to war? Is he going to, you know, make a run for it? And which one of those two things is actually the courageous act? So he spends his summer doing that until finally he decides to hit the road. He just walks off the job one day, comes home, grabs the car, and takes off. Headed north. It is, you know, telling that Tim O'Brien, the author, also born in Minnesota, Tim O'Brien, the author, in interviews, will not say, there's no indication in the interviews I've seen, read, heard, that this is based on things that he actually did, other than the fact that he had just graduated college when his draft notice arrived as well. And so, but there's no indication, or at least he doesn't cop to the reality that he himself, you know, hit the road and thought about, or made an attempted flight north. He gets to just below the Canadian border, the Rainy River, and for inexplicable reasons decides to just pull over and lay low for a day or two, try to pull himself together, and he winds up at the Tip Top Lodge. And I'm on page 45, when he shows up at the Tip Top Lodge and goes up, he knocks on the door. The man who opened the door at the very bottom that day is the hero of my life. How do I say this without sounding sappy? Blurted out, the man saved me. He offered exactly what I needed without questions, without any words at all. He took me in. That self-referential blurted out, right? That breaking of the fourth wall, that you know, Tim O'Brien, the character, who's an author, telling the story, telling himself to just say it, right? Again, there's a kind of hearkening to an earlier text, a poem by the great American poet Elizabeth Bishop. The poem's entitled One Art, written in the style of a sonnet. It's a little bit longer than a sonnet, yes. But it's just this fantastic little poem that I really, really just love that she writes. and was published in 1976, so that Tim O'Brien, the author of our text, he would have had a chance to be aware of it as well, right? And it's a poem about losing things, and it starts small, but it builds, and as it builds, of course, it builds an emotional intensity. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with intent to be lost, that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident. The art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, parenthetical, write it, close parentheses, does it like disaster. The speaker, right, runs through the list of things that you lose. You lose something every day, what it was you meant to say, you lose your car keys temporarily, right? And then you sort of lose names and places, old friends you had, middle school, elementary school, in my case, high school, college, people that you used to know that now are no longer around or that you remember. You kind of like forget where they were, what they were like, right? And then you start losing, maybe you lose family heirlooms, right? You lose trips you intended to take. You lose things that you were valuable, goals that maybe you had set that now you realize you can't make for whatever set of reasons. You lose the house, houses you lived in that you loved, but for whatever set of reasons you had to move, places you live, right? Maybe on a different continent. Elizabeth Bishop spent a good portion of her adult life in South America. So you lose places, right? Time goes on, things change. You have to sort of give up, or just move on, right? Until you get to the place where you start to lose, you lose your lover, you lose the loved one. Maybe it's a breakup, maybe it's a falling apart, maybe it's actually, God forbid, death, something really horrific, right? But you lose it, and while you were able to convince yourself that each one of those things prior, the lost names, the lost, car keys, wasn't ultimately a disaster, now it's much harder to convince yourself that it's not a disaster, so much so that in the very last line, the poet breaks through and has to tell herself in that parenthetical, write it, right? And it's that interjection, that breaking of that wall. And here we have it again. O'Brien, author, character, saying, blurt it, right? Blurt it out, just say it, right? And so the point I'm making, or starting to make, trying to ramp up to make, right, with these kind of references to other texts, outside texts, is going to be one that is a hallmark of postmodernism. And the term for it is intertextuality, right? And it's both in the small things in On the Rainy River, right? These kind of references, but also in the bigger things. On the Rainy River functions like a kind of war story, right? It has these kind of characteristics, issues of courage, issue of the young man trying to decide to go fight in the battle, issue of how to face fear, how to overcome that, how to be a patriot, do the things. All these things are going to be present in On the Rainy River. So we get the sense that it is a kind of war story, but it's a certain kind of war story. In this case, it's going to be a postmodern war story. And some of that has to do with that intertextuality. On the bottom of 46, top of 47, having introduced the idea of intertextuality, I'm counting on you for this, kids. This will make the whole year worthwhile if in that very last line, right? He's talking about the 6 days he spent with Elroy Bergdahl, right? And we spent 6 days together at Tip Top Lodge, just the 2 of us. Tourist season was over and there were no boats in the river, and the wilderness seemed to withdraw into a great permanent stillness. Yeah, I'm going to make the argument that you can't reference the wilderness as a character, give it any kind of sentience anymore without a nod in the direction of Joseph Conrad. Right? that novel, right? You think I have some of these things willy-nilly? There's a reason why we read what we read. I have some kind of plan. It may not be a great one, but it was a plan. They connect. Right? This kind of looking at the wilderness as a character, even briefly. Again, I would be happy to make the argument that Tim O'Brien, the author, a learned red man, knows exactly what he's doing and is making a small little reference to Conrad here, right? So, and the wilderness here retreats into a great permanent stillness. Unlike the wilderness that takes Kurtz's head, right, and caresses it and shapes it and makes him, as amoral and evil, so to speak, as the wilderness is, here the wilderness retreats into a stillness, just a kind of watching and waiting. So he gets, he's there, he's tormented. Elroy seems to know it, but gives him space to sort it out, right? And we come to a kind of climactic moment in the text, right? The little fishing trip. So, but before we do, we have this kind of memory, page 52, looking back after 20 years, I sometimes wonder if the events that summer didn't happen in some other dimension, a place where your life exists before you've lived it and where it goes afterward. None of it seemed real. During my time at the Tip Top Lodge, I had the feeling that I'd slipped out of my own skin, hovering a few feet away while some poor yo-yo with my name and face tried to make his way toward a future he didn't understand and didn't want. Even now, I can see myself as I was then. It's like watching an old home movie. I'm young and tan and fit. I've got hair, lots of it. I don't smoke or drink. I'm wearing faded blue jeans and a white polo shirt, right? And he sees himself, right? There's this kind of memory. And it's that this in this paragraph, in the middle of this paragraph, he talks about, O'Brien, the author, is referencing the ways we create the self out of memory, out of desires, out of wishes, out of ambitions, out of anguish and worry and stress. We create a kind of self, and there's this kind of sense where we can pull ourselves even away from that and watch and see that other self, right? But now there's, which one is the real self? The one sitting on the deck with Elroy, or the one watching? So this kind of lack of identity or multiplicity of identities that each of us inhabit, right? Whitman's famous line, I contain multitudes. There are many of us inside of us. It would be nice if it was a unified self, but after modernism and certainly inside postmodernism, that doesn't exist. And O'Brien knows it, and he references that a little bit later on in that same paragraph on 52. I try to explain some of my feelings, but there aren't enough words, and so I just say that it's a thing that has to be done. He's talking about the letter he's trying to write to his parents, right? And the way that words and language is failing him, the way that words and language and trying to explain who he is and why he feels something, he can't find the words, in part because the words don't represent truth. If words were a one-to-one correspondence to truth, we could put the words there and people would know. But it doesn't happen that way, right? Language fails us in that sense. And so here we are trapped inside language. It's the only thing we got to explain and express ourselves, but it doesn't always speak the truth that we want it to speak. Page 54, there's a nice little moment where O'Brien, the character, says, even now, as I write this, I can still feel that tightness, talking about that moment of decision, right? The tightness that was in his chest, where he had to decide, swim for Canada or go back and fight the war. And he says, and I want you to feel it. The wind coming off the river, the waves, the silence, the wooded frontier. You're at the bow of a boat on the rainy river. You're 21 years old. You're scared. There's a hard squeezing pressure in your chest, right? And it wants you to feel it. That's what O'Brien, the author, understands that words are for. Words may not be able to convey to you, if he puts them down as accurately as he possibly can, what it actually was, right? This our decision that Tim O'Brien, the author, went through, won't be able to convey what Tim O'Brien, the author, actually felt. And this is where the work of story and the work of fiction, and in essence, the work of lying, becomes valuable. It allows us to get at a kind of emotional truth, O'Brien would argue, that that the actual true description wouldn't do for us. He wants us to feel it. And so he invents this story about the rainy river that, by all accounts, if you look up Tim O'Brien, the author, didn't happen. Right? Page 55, he realizes that Canada was a fantasy. It was no longer a possibility. Right then, with the shore so close, I understood I would not do what I should do. I would not swim away from my hometown and my country and my life. I would not be brave. That old image of myself as hero, as a man of conscience and courage, all that was just a threadbare pipe dream. Bobbing there on the rainy river, looking back at the Minnesota shore, I felt a sudden swell of helplessness come over me, a drowning sensation, as if I'd toppled overboard and was being swept away by the silver waves. Right? The created identity, the identity of what he thought courage would look like, be like, feel like, doesn't happen. Right? And it's the precursor, it's the foreshadowing of those last two sentences of the whole chapter itself, that the courage that he once thought he would possess, which in Tim O'Brien, the character's case, would be the courage to jump overboard and go to Canada. That would be the actual courageous thing to do. Whereas American patriotism would say the courageous thing would be to go and fight the war, right? Tim O'Brien, the author, doesn't, I mean, Tim O'Brien, the character, doesn't accept that. And in a certain sense, he realizes he can't pull either one of them off. He can't do it, right? And so we come to the end, page 58. So the day was cloudy. I passed through, he's driving back home now, right? He's left Elroy, he's left the rainy river, he's left his witness there, right? A nice religious illusion, the way that Elroy functioned like a witness, like God, or like the gods who look on in absolute silence as we live our lives, as we make our choices or fail to make them. Right? Religion, in most religions in many ways, hinge on this idea that there is an observer, right? That there is, be that God or Allah or Yahweh or whoever you want to put there, there's at the bare minimum an observer who set us up and got us running, but we can't enact with, we can't grab hold of. And Elroy functions as a kind of observer for O'Brien, the character. So O'Brien packs up, leaves. Elroy's not around to say goodbye by design. He's driving home, right? He says, I passed through towns with familiar names, to the pine forest and down to the prairie and then to Vietnam, where I was a soldier, and then home again. I survived, but it's not a happy ending. I was a coward. I went to war. Right? And so all that courage he thought he had at the beginning, which would have led him to living a kind of American patriotic heroism, right? O'Brien, the character, disdains. He realizes at the end that the courageous thing perhaps would have been to go to Canada. The cowardly act is to do what everybody else tells you to do, is to go to war, to do the thing that is not you and your desires, but the thing that society has set up. And for O'Brien, the character, that's the cowardly action. And in a way, it's kind of the ironic, typical war story, right? The typical war story, the main character finds heroism, rises above fears, goes, acts courageously, wins the battle, saves the day, finds Private Ryan, does whatever it is that he's here, I guess in this day and age, she is being called to do. But, and then brings it all back home and receives the hero's welcome. That's the typical war story. Here we've got a war story of the postmodern age, right? One that is war story as a kind of construction, recognizes the kind of metafictional nature, the intertextual nature of a war story. War stories themselves depend on other war stories, depend on the idea of there being Achilles' last stand, being battles fought by Odysseus, being, Agamemnon, all these kind of lineages of great war, heroic actions in war, going all the way back to the Greeks. You can throw in the Old Testament if you like, all the way up through you know, the Romans, battles, in the European battles, American battles, George Washington, Valley Forge, all that kind of stuff, right? And we can trace this kind of telling of war stories that end with courageous acts. And here the character can't do what he deems to be the ultimate courageous act, right? The actual acting for self. Instead, he takes on the cowardly act. He goes to Vietnam, a war he doesn't believe in, doesn't think is right, doesn't think is fair or just or worth it or should even be happening. But nonetheless, he agrees to go and fight in it anyway. And so in that way, O'Brien, the author, is standing the war story itself on its head, and surely challenging our notions of that. So we can add intertextuality. We can think about metafiction again, the way that he is using the war story as a kind of trope to understand this. And we can sort of, again, continue to see how the things they carried is a postmodernist text. More later. Thanks for listening.